Picture this. It is July 1681, and you are standing in the hold of a buccaneer sloop somewhere in the Pacific, 63 days out of the Juan Fernandez Islands. The ship rolls. The bilge stinks of tar and rat urine and something worse, something sweet and rotten, like a wound going bad. You are here because the quartermaster has sent you below with a wooden bucket to draw the crew's daily water ration. You find the cask, you pull the bung, and the smell hits you before the liquid does. A thick, soupy reek that makes your eyes water. You tilt the bucket under the spigot, and what comes out is not water. Not anymore. It is a green-brown slurry, warm to the touch, threaded with slime, flecked with sediment that moves. You hold it up to the lantern. Things float in it. Things that were not there when this cask was filled 2 months ago. You drink it anyway. You have to. There is nothing else. This is not a horror story. This is not the worst day on this voyage. This is Tuesday. This is every Tuesday and every Wednesday and every Thursday for months on end, on virtually every long-range sailing vessel of the 17th and 18th centuries, pirate, privateer, merchantman, and Royal Navy alike. The Golden Age of Piracy was not killed by the gallows or the cannon. It was fought, every single day, against an enemy no cutlass could touch, the water in the cask, and somehow, against everything we know about biology, thousands of men drank that green poison and lived. This is how. To understand why water was the deadliest thing on a ship, you have to understand how much of it a crew needed, and how little room there was to carry it. A working sailor in the tropics required at least 1 gallon of fresh water per day, roughly 8 pounds. On a vessel carrying 80 men, that is 640 pounds of water consumed every 24 hours. A typical Atlantic crossing from Bristol to Barbados took 6 to 8 weeks under fair conditions, longer in foul weather. A Pacific crossing, say, from Acapulco to Guam along the old Manila galleon route, could take 3 months or more. Do the math. 80 men for 90 days means 7,200 gallons, or roughly 60,000 pounds of water, before you count cooking, cleaning, or any margin of error. All of it stored in wooden casks. The cask was the single most important technology on a sailing vessel, and it was profoundly, fatally imperfect. Coopers, barrel makers, built water casks from oak staves, bent and bound with iron hoops, sealed with pitch and tallow. A well-made leaguer held around 150 imperial gallons. But well-made was relative. Staves warped in the heat, hoops rusted and loosened, pitch cracked, seams wept, and from the moment fresh water entered the cask, it began to die. The process was invisible at first. Bacteria from the wood, from the water source, from the hands that filled the cask, began to multiply in the warm, dark, anaerobic interior. Within 2 to 3 weeks, the water turned cloudy. Within 4 to 6 weeks, a biofilm of algae and cyanobacteria coated the inner staves, a green slime that modern microbiologists would recognize as a thriving bacterial mat. The water tasted foul. It smelled worse. It developed a ropey, mucilaginous texture that sailors called long water. Pull a cup and it stretched, stranding between your lips and the rim. And yet, here is the paradox that confounded contemporary physicians and still surprises modern readers. This water, in most cases, would not kill you. It was disgusting. It caused cramps, nausea, and diarrhea. But the organisms responsible for the rot were overwhelmingly non-pathogenic. The bacteria consuming the dissolved organics in the cask were, for the most part, environmental species, Pseudomonas, Flavobacterium, assorted cyanobacteria, that colonized the water because conditions favored them, not because they were targeting human hosts. The real killers, Vibrio cholerae, Salmonella typhi, the pathogens behind cholera and typhoid, required specific contamination events, fecal matter in the source water, infected crew handling the supply, or shore water drawn downstream of settlements. When those killers got into the cask, men died fast and in numbers, but routine biological rot, the green slime that terrified every new sailor on his first long passage, was more revolting than lethal. Nobody in the 17th century understood this. They could not. Germ theory would not arrive for another 200 years. What they understood was practical. Some water went bad and killed you, and some water went bad and did not, and you had no way of knowing which was which until men started dying. So they developed a toolkit of survival strategies, part chemistry, part tradition, part desperate improvisation, that kept crews alive across oceans that should have killed them. The best eyewitness accounts of shipboard water come from men who were obsessed with survival, the chronic journalers. William Dampier, navigator, naturalist, privateer, and the first Englishman to set foot on Australia, sailed around the world 3 times between 1679 and 1711. His journals, published as A New Voyage Round the World in 1697, and later as A Voyage to New Holland in 1703, are compulsive records of provisions, weather, and water quality. Dampier documented water failures with the clinical detachment of a man who has learned not to panic. During his Pacific crossing aboard the privateer Signet in 1686, he records the crew's water as so foul that they could only drink it by holding their noses and straining it through their teeth. He notes the color, greenish, and the smell, stinking, and then moves on to the next observation, because complaining about the water was like complaining about the wind. It was simply the condition of life at sea. Dampier was unusual among his contemporaries because he noticed everything and judged nothing. His water entries read like field notes from a biologist who happens to be dying of thirst. He records the color changes day by day. He notes which casks spoiled first, always the ones filled from rivers near settlements, never the ones filled from mountain streams. He did not understand why, but he documented the pattern. And modern science has confirmed his observation. Source water contamination determines spoilage speed. A cask filled from a clean highland spring carried fewer bacteria to start with, and lasted longer than one filled from a lowland river downstream of farms and latrines. Dampier saw it. He wrote it down. 300 years later, his notes still hold. Edward Barlow, a common seaman who sailed from the 1650s to the 1690s, left a journal that is one of the most remarkable first-hand accounts of lower-deck life in the age of sail. Barlow was not a captain or a gentleman. He was a working sailor, and his account of water rationing is visceral. On a Mediterranean voyage aboard the Royal Charles, formerly the Naseby, renamed at the Restoration in 1660, in the early 1660s, Barlow describes the crew's daily ration cut to 3 pints, barely enough to survive in southern heat. The water, he writes, was stinking and full of maggots, and men fought over it regardless. He records how sailors would lick the condensation off the inside of the ship's timbers in the early morning, when the temperature difference between the cold sea and the warming deck created a thin film of moisture on the wood, licking the ship. That was how desperate it got. What makes Barlow's account invaluable is his perspective from below. Officers and captains controlled the water supply. Common sailors received it. Barlow writes from the receiving end, and his resentment is palpable. He notes that the captain's cabin had its own water cask, filled separately, tended separately, and, he suspects, replaced more often. The officers' water was not the same water the crew drank. It never was. The hierarchy of the ship extended all the way down into the cask. Woodes Rogers, privateer captain, future governor of the Bahamas, the man who rescued Alexander Selkirk from the island that inspired Robinson Crusoe, recorded equally grim water conditions during his circumnavigation of 1708 to 1711 aboard the Duke and Duchess. Rogers was meticulous about provisions. He documented how his crews mixed wine, brandy, and lime juice with rotting water to mask the taste. And he noted that men who refused the treated water in favor of untreated stores fared measurably worse. Rogers also recorded something that most captains ignored: the psychological toll. Men who believed their water was killing them suffered more than men who believed it was merely foul. Fear compounded the physical symptoms. The mind made the body worse. The solutions these men recorded were consistent across decades and nationalities. First, alcohol. Not as a replacement for water, despite what popular culture suggests. No ship ever sailed on rum alone, but as an additive. Brandy, wine, or later rum, was mixed into the water ration at ratios of roughly 1 part spirit to 3 or 4 parts water. The alcohol did not sterilize the water in any meaningful microbiological sense. The concentrations were far too low, but it did two things. It masked the taste and smell enough to make the water drinkable, and, in the case of wine especially, it introduced a mild acidity that slowed bacterial growth at the surface. Sailors discovered this empirically, centuries before anyone understood pH levels. Second, vinegar. Ships carried large quantities of vinegar, not for salads, but for fumigation and water treatment. Vinegar was poured into casks as a rinse between fillings and added to water in small quantities when it began to turn. Like alcohol, it worked by shifting acidity, not by killing bacteria directly, but it worked well enough. Third, beer and small beer. In northern European waters, beer was the default daily drink, not water. The Royal Navy's standard daily ration in the early 18th century was 1 gallon of small beer per man, a low-alcohol brew of roughly 2 to 3%. The brewing process, boiling the water, fermenting the sugars, introducing hops, achieved what no amount of cask management could. It produced a biologically stable liquid that resisted spoilage for weeks. Beer went sour eventually, but it took far longer to become dangerous than water did. The Navy knew this and planned accordingly. Beer for the first weeks of a voyage. Water only when the beer ran out. The transition from beer to water was the moment every crew dreaded, because it marked the beginning of the slow decline. Fourth, rainwater collection. Every experienced captain rigged canvas catchments when rain was expected. Dampier describes spreading the mainsail as a funnel during tropical squalls, channeling hundreds of gallons of fresh rainwater directly into casks. Rogers did the same. The advantage was not just volume, but purity. Rainwater carried no ground source contamination, and if the canvas was reasonably clean, it entered the cask with a lower bacterial load than any river or spring water. Fifth, and this is the one nobody talks about, the water often fixed itself. Modern microbiological research has confirmed what sailors observed empirically. Cask water that passes through the green rot phase will, if left long enough, often clarify on its own. The bacterial bloom consumes the available dissolved organics, exhausts its nutrient supply, and dies back. The dead biomass settles to the bottom as sediment. The remaining water, while not sterile, is significantly cleaner than it was at the peak of the bloom. Sailors called this the third water, the stage after fresh and after foul, when the water came around again. Long voyage captains knew that if they could survive the middle weeks of a crossing, the water would improve. Not because anyone intervened, but because the biology ran its course. But knowing the science, even the folk science, did not make it bearable. The daily reality of drinking rotten water at sea was a test of will that no amount of rum could fully ease. And nowhere was it more extreme than on the longest, most punishing voyages of the age, the Pacific crossings. Consider the Manila galleon route. Spanish treasure galleons crossed from Acapulco to Manila and back every year from 1565 to 1815, a round trip of roughly 10 months. The westbound crossing alone, sailing with the trade winds, took 2 to 3 months of open ocean with no land, no resupply, no rain guaranteed. The eastbound return, against the current, could take 4 to 6 months. The water situation on these voyages was catastrophic. Spanish records document death tolls of 30 to 50% on some crossings, not from combat, not from storms, but from scurvy, dysentery, and dehydration compounded by water so foul that men could not physically swallow it. The buccaneer expeditions into the Pacific in the 1680s faced the same conditions. When Bartholomew Sharp took the Trinity around Cape Horn and into the Pacific in 1680, his crews endured months of water rationing. William Dampier, sailing with a subsequent expedition under Captain Swan aboard the Signet, recorded the Pacific crossing of 1686 from Mexico to the East Indies, where the crew was reduced to half a pint of water per man per day. Barely enough to sustain life in equatorial heat. Men collapsed at the rigging. Fights broke out over water casks. Dampier records that the crew discussed eating Captain Swan if provisions ran out, and he is not certain they were joking. The ingenuity born of this desperation was remarkable. Sailors learned to chew lead musket balls to stimulate saliva production when water was scarce, a practice that may have contributed to lead poisoning over long careers but kept mouths moist in the short term. They chewed oakum, the tarred rope fibre used for caulking, for the same reason. They soaked their shirts in seawater and wore them wet, reducing water loss through the skin. They rationed their movements, lying still in the shade during the hottest hours to conserve moisture, working only at dawn and dusk. They drank turtle blood when they could catch a turtle. They drank the watery fluid inside flying fish, caught on deck at night. On some vessels, the carpenter was ordered to disassemble the ship's spare water casks and use the staves as firewood to boil seawater into a crude distillation apparatus, a copper pot with a coiled tube running through a tub of seawater for cooling. The output was slow, barely a gallon per hour, and tasted of copper and salt. But it was water. The Royal Navy, to its credit, took the problem seriously, not out of compassion, but out of operational necessity. A ship that lost its crew to bad water was a ship that could not fight. By the early 18th century, Admiralty dockyards were charring the inside of water casks before filling them, a process that created a thin layer of activated carbon on the inner staves. This charcoal lining adsorbed some dissolved organics and reduced bacterial adhesion, extending the usable life of the water by several weeks. It was not understood in chemical terms. It was understood as the casks that have been fired keep the water sweeter. That was enough. Pirates had no dockyards, no Admiralty supply chain, no coopers on retainer. They improvised, and their improvisations reveal a practical intelligence that the romantic image of piracy completely obscures. Pirate articles, the written codes of conduct that governed ships, like those of Bartholomew Roberts and Edward Lowe, routinely included provisions about water management. Roberts' articles, as recorded in Captain Charles Johnson's A General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, specified that any man found wasting water or failing to maintain the casks could be punished by the crew. Water was too precious for individual negligence. On a pirate ship, water discipline was literally written into the constitution, and when the casks ran low, pirates did what navies and merchantmen could not. They stopped wherever they wanted, careening. The practice of beaching a ship to clean and repair her hull was also, always, a watering stop. Pirates sought out isolated bays with freshwater streams precisely because those streams meant survival. The famous pirate haunts of the Caribbean, the cays off Cuba, the mangrove channels of the Mosquito Coast, the rivers of Hispaniola, were not chosen for their scenery. They were chosen for their water. A pirate captain who knew where to find sweet water was worth more to his crew than one who knew where to find gold, because gold does not keep you alive at latitude 12 north in August. But watering was dangerous. A crew sent ashore with empty casks was a crew exposed to ambush by colonial militias, to attack by indigenous peoples defending their territory, to desertion by men who saw the jungle and decided that anything was better than the sea. Watering parties went armed. They posted sentries. They worked fast, and they filled every cask they had, because nobody knew when the next opportunity would come. Here is the myth. Pirates drank rum all day, swinging from the rigging, bottle in hand, roaring sea shanties under a tropical sun. Here is the record. Pirates drank whatever they could get, including green water that would make a modern health inspector weep. And the rum, when there was rum, was as much medicine as indulgence. The popular image of the permanently drunk pirate owes more to Robert Louis Stevenson than to any logbook. Treasure Island, published in 1883, gave the world Long John Silver and the yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum refrain. The 1950 Disney film cemented it. Pirates of the Caribbean turned it into a theme park punchline, but the documentary evidence tells a different story. Alcohol at sea was rationed, not unlimited. The Royal Navy's official rum ration, the famous tot, was not introduced until 1740, when Admiral Edward Vernon ordered rum mixed with water to reduce drunkenness aboard his ships in the Caribbean. The mixture was called grog, after Vernon's nickname, Old Grog, which came from his grogram cloak. Before 1740, the standard naval drink was beer, not rum, and even after the introduction of the rum ration, the daily allowance was half a pint of rum diluted in a quart of water, enough to take the edge off the water's taste, not enough to get meaningfully drunk. On pirate ships, the evidence suggests that alcohol was similarly managed. Pirate articles frequently prescribed punishment for drunkenness on duty. The romanticism of the drunken pirate ignores a basic operational reality. A drunk crew cannot fight, cannot sail, and cannot survive. Pirate captains who allowed their crews to drink without restraint did not last long, not because of mutiny, but because drunk men make fatal mistakes with rigging, with navigation, and with the sea itself. The truth is that water, foul, green, stinking water, was the baseline drink of every man at sea, pirate or otherwise. Rum was the exception. Beer was the preference. And the hierarchy of drinks mapped directly to the hierarchy of survival. Clean rainwater was gold, beer was silver, spirit-treated water was bronze, and untreated cask water, the green stuff, was what you drank when everything else was gone, which, on a long enough voyage, was always. And here is a detail the treasure-obsessed accounts almost never mention. Some pirate attacks were not about gold at all. They were about water. A merchantman intercepted in mid-ocean carried full casks, fresh, clean, recently loaded at a colonial port. For a pirate crew weeks into foul water, those casks were more valuable than the cargo in the hold. Johnson records multiple instances of pirate crews stripping captured vessels of their water and provisions while leaving the trade goods untouched. The ship was not the prize. The water was. The irony is that popular culture has made the least important liquid on a pirate ship into the most iconic one. Jack Sparrow staggers through 5 films, clutching a bottle of rum. Every Halloween costume comes with a plastic flask. "Why is the rum always gone?" became a meme, a t-shirt, a cultural shorthand for piracy itself, and in the process, the real story, the one about water, desperation, ingenuity, and the daily negotiation with biology that kept these men alive, disappeared entirely. It is not hard to see why. Green slime does not sell tickets. Licking condensation off a ship's timbers is not cinematic. The image of a man straining water through his teeth while holding his breath is not something you put on a lunchbox. But the erasure goes deeper than aesthetics. When we replace water with rum in the pirate story, we replace survival with indulgence. We turn men who were solving one of the hardest logistical problems in the pre-industrial world, how to keep 100 human bodies hydrated across 3,000 miles of open ocean, into cartoon drunks. We take their most impressive achievement and make it invisible. Consider what they actually accomplished. Without laboratories, without microscopes, without any understanding of microbiology, these men developed a water management system that worked. They learned which sources produced better water. They figured out that charring a cask helped, that vinegar slowed the rot, that alcohol made the difference between drinkable and undrinkable. They observed the third water phenomenon, the self-clarification, and built their voyage timing around it. They wrote water discipline into their articles of governance, treating it with the same seriousness as the division of plunder. That is not romance. That is engineering. There is a phrase that appears in the old nautical manuals, repeated so often that it became a kind of prayer. "Sweet water will carry you home." It meant what it said. If your water held, if it stayed drinkable long enough to reach port, you would survive. If it did not, no amount of seamanship could save you. The sea does not negotiate. It does not care about your flag, your articles, your courage, or your crimes. It cares about the water in your cask. Every Golden Age pirate who sailed beyond sight of land understood this in his bones, not as theory, not as science, but as the most basic and relentless fact of his existence, that the thing keeping him alive was also the thing most likely to kill him, and that the margin between the two was thinner than the slime on the inside of an oak stave. The men who survived the longest voyages were not the bravest or the strongest. They were the ones who respected the water. They checked the casks. They watched the color change and knew what it meant. They did not waste a drop, not in bravado, not in carelessness, not in rage. They understood, in the way that only people who have been genuinely thirsty can understand, that civilization is not built on courage or conquest. It is built on clean water. Take that away, and everything else follows. The sea taught them that. The cask proved it. Every single day. We remember the battles. We remember the treasure. We remember the flags and the names and the hangings. We forget the water. And the water was everything. Somewhere in the South Atlantic, right now, the current is carrying a piece of oak. It might be a stave from a barrel. It might be a splinter from a hull. It does not matter. The wood is old and dark and smooth, worn by salt until it looks like bone. It has been in the water a long time. The organisms that once grew inside it, the green film, the bacterial mat, the slime that made a sailor gag 300 years ago, are long gone. The ocean has cleaned it. The sun has bleached it. The sea has done what it always does. It has taken what men left behind and turned it into something else, something neutral, something that belongs to the water now. If you pulled that piece of wood from the sea and held it up to your nose, it would smell of nothing, just salt, just ocean. But once, it held the only thing between a man and death, and he drank it green.